Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I guess we have participants from many different places around the world at very different time zones. So many thanks for the great efforts to join this session despite these circumstances. We have an increasing number of attendees joining the session, but we can get started. Welcome to the session, and thanks again for joining the webinar. We are going to be discussing with the team on decarbonization strategies for buildings and its contribution towards transitions to net zero emissions. And we really hope, the whole team, that you are, as well as your families, doing well and healthy given these challenging times, and we would like to send you our best wishes. So for the ones you haven't met me, I'm Araceli Fernandez. I'm coordinating the work on the demand sectors at the Energy, Technology and Policy Division at the IEA. And I'm going to be moderating the webinar today, which would be really interesting and a pleasure for me. We have organized this webinar with the support from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and also the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. So we'd like to thank, first of all, as those organizations that have provided help to make this session happen today. We are going to have this session today, which is being part of a series of webinars that we are organizing at the IEA as part of, or since the release of the Energy Technology Perspectives 2020, which is the IEA flagship publication on clean energy technologies. And our intention with these webinars is really to discuss with experts around the world our work and analysis on critical sectors and technologies in their contribution to these pathways towards net zero emissions. So we really look forward for the discussion today, and I'm sure there will be follow-up discussions and exchanges from this. We've got quite an interesting and complete agenda today. The session will last about 2 hours, and we've structured it in 3 main blocks. The first part will be about setting some context for the discussions, and for this we'll have 2 excellent speakers providing opening remarks. The first one being Timo Good, which is the head of the Energy, Technology and Policy Division at the IEA, and then following by Roland Hunziker, which is the Director for Sustainable Buildings and Cities at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Following that first part, we'll have the presentation of the buildings analysis within the Energy Technology Perspectives 2020 project by my colleagues Thibaut Abergel and Chiara Del Mastro, who are the leads of the analysis related to the building sector within this for this project. And we'll follow this presentation with a Q&A session for which we'll ask you kindly to post all your questions in the chat box in the GoToWebinar window, and you can do that throughout the whole let's say session, so that then we'll compile those questions and structure them so that we could address as many as possible during that Q&A session following the presentation. Then the third or final part of the webinar today would be a panel discussion with excellent experts as well around the world, again in different regions and with different time zones. So again, thanks for the efforts there. So those will be discussing on how to accelerate the transition towards sustainable buildings. So I'm sure we'll have excellent insights and interesting exchanges there. So with that, without really further ado, so we can make it really through the whole agenda, I'm gonna give the floor to Timo Good, who's gonna provide his opening remarks. So Timo, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Araceli, and indeed, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Warm welcome to today's webinar on what is required from the building sector so that the world at large can reach net zero emissions from the energy sector in the long term. As Araceli already mentioned, today's webinar is built around our publication Energy Technology Perspectives that we revamped this year in 2020 after taking a break of 3 years since it was last launched in 2017. The reason why we took a break is because we wanted to understand how we can increase the relevance of this publication for real-world decisions for decision makers who are currently looking into clean energy technologies. And the vision that our executive director set out for the revamping of energy technology perspectives was to create a world's guidebook on clean energy technologies that can actually help decision makers in the difficult undertaking to understand the various different technology opportunities for their very own energy sectors. With the outbreak of the pandemic this year, we decided to launch energy technology perspectives this year in 3 different installments. The first one was actually a special report on clean energy innovation that we released in early July. It was the first report ever, to the best of our knowledge, that quantified the amount of technology innovation needed for the energy sector to reach net zero emissions in the long term. The report was launched together with an ETP Clean Energy Technology Guide, about which you will hear more in the presentation later today. It's a technology guide that maps out more than 400 clean energy technologies and their current status of deployment. The second report that we launched was a special report on carbon capture, utilization and storage in September, which was launched together with Prime Minister Erna Solberg of Norway, against the background of the Norwegian government announcing its Longskip project. And finally, there was the full Energy Technology Perspectives 2020 publication that was released also in September, which took a very careful and deep look at the technology needs across all parts of the energy sector to reach net zero emissions. And among the core themes that we explored there was the extent of emissions from existing energy infrastructure across all parts of the energy system, how to address emissions from sectors that are sometimes referred to as hard to abate, like long distance transport and heavy industries, and the role of different new and emerging fuels such as hydrogen for a clean energy future. Now, Energy Technology Perspectives also contained a lot of detailed analysis and modeling on the building sector, which is obviously the focus of today's webinar. And I would like to thank my colleagues Araceli Fernandez-Pares, who, as she already mentioned, coordinates our end-use analysis and modeling, together with Thibaut Abergel and Chiara Del Mastro, who have done a great job on understanding transitions from clean energy transitions in the building sector in particular, and who are the lead of this analysis in our division. Buildings is not always referred to as, or is not commonly and understandably referred to as hard to abate in that sense, because from a technology point of view, it is not necessarily the same type of challenge that we are set up for in as in heavy industries or long distance transport, but it's a challenging sector to decarbonize nonetheless, and it's a very important one to decarbonize, which you feel best, I think, in the spirit of looking at the building sector in its wider energy system context. If you do that and you stack up the emissions that come directly from the use of burning fossil fuels in the buildings sector, when you add the indirect emissions that are related to electricity and commercial heat provision that are connected to the building sector, and when you look at the emissions that are related to the manufacturing of building construction and renovation materials, then you end up at CO2 emissions that are directly or indirectly related to the building sector of nearly 40%. So it's a very important sector to analyze and to look into much more in detail. There are, as I said, from a technology perspective, a number of opportunities already available to decarbonize the industry, building sector type of operations, from heat pumps and solar PV to district energy systems, geothermal energy, resource efficient construction processes, etc. But it's not an easy undertaking, despite the availability of technology, to decarbonize buildings. This is because of the diversity. When you look at the various different climatic zones, the buildings types, the occupant needs that are associated with buildings. When you think about the legacy that comes with the building stock, buildings, as you all know, once they have been built, can live for 100 years and more. And we here in Paris, we can see this obviously on a daily basis, that buildings can be in place for a very, very long time. And the third element that is important is the vast variety of different stakeholders that is involved in these kind of buildings sector considerations that are a bit more systemic and looking a bit broader, where obviously decarbonizing buildings and the wider operation requires an integrated policy framework moving forward. The presentation and the panel discussion that we'll be seeing today will discuss these challenges, and I'm particularly happy with the support of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on today's event. I will now invite our colleague Roland Hunziger from the World Business Council of Sustainable Development for his opening remarks. WBCSD is a long-standing partner of the IEA with a lot of synergetic areas across the various different work streams that we are working on respectively. So Roland, thank you very much for being here with us today, for supporting this webinar, disseminating also this webinar across your network, and very warm welcome, and I look forward to hearing your speech. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Timur. Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive introduction. And I'd like to thank Araceli and Thibaut, obviously, for including me and to give me the opportunity to briefly provide you with a few thoughts to introduce this really interesting webinar that we're organizing today. You gave a great overview of the built environment, and I would like to pick up from that number of the 40% and why we understand it to be 40% and why this is such an important sector, and how, with the help of the work you're doing at the IEA, we can really better understand how we work on the trajectories that will get us to net zero in this sector. On Saturday, we celebrated the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, and the UK Secretary in charge of COP26, Alok Sharma, he urged governments that while the current level of ambition is encouraging, it is still not enough to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees. And the built environment in this is a critical system if we are to reach the targets of the Paris Agreement. You mentioned it, it makes up close to 40% of the energy-related global greenhouse gas emissions if we consider all the emissions that are associated with it. So from the extraction of materials to the manufacturing to the construction, and then the use phase of buildings, as well as their eventual demolishing and reuse. To tackle these emissions from the built environment, we need to take a systems perspective as well as a life cycle approach. The systems perspective means that we look at the full value chain to include all the actors that are involved in the planning, in the building, and in the operating of buildings as well as infrastructure. It includes the manufacturers of materials, the construction firms, the owners and tenants using the buildings, but also we sometimes refer to that as the influencer value chain, the architecture and engineering firms, real estate developers, and banks and investors. These firms do not have necessarily emissions on their own balance sheet, scope 1, 2, or 3, but they have a very important influence over emissions of the life cycle of built assets. And also those actors who have the power to regulate emissions, such as cities and national regulators. A life cycle approach means that we need to look at the emissions not only from the energy that is used during the operation of buildings, but as you mentioned, the embodied emissions from the manufacturing of materials, the construction process, and also renovation and demolishment. Looking at the full life cycle and the system allows us to work with all these actors who have the highest influence over the emissions, and in particularly in the earliest phase of a project before construction and emissions actually start. Now, I'm very grateful to the IEA that you are convening this discussion today, because it will help us better understand the total emissions from the built environment. As we know, these numbers are already the basis for the assessment in the yearly global status report of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, the global ABC, of which we both, IEA and WBCSD, are a member of the steering committee. The 2020 report will be launched this coming Wednesday, the 16th of December at 3 p.m. Central European Time during an online press conference, and I recommend you that you attend if your agenda allows it. Now, going forward, it will be interesting to explore further how the energy technology perspectives analysis can support us in building the relevant pathways for the built environment to reach net zero across the full life cycle of built assets by 2050. This will support our work, helping companies and sectors develop their net zero targets and pathways, and it will inform the global ABC in driving forward the work that engages national governments to develop their roadmaps for buildings and construction and to support their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, related to this sector. I mentioned at the beginning the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement this weekend. It is also the 5th anniversary of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which many of us here on this webinar have helped create. And I look forward to continuing our collaboration to achieve our common vision of a zero emissions, efficient and resilient buildings and construction sector. With that, I look forward to our discussion today and hearing from you, from the ETP perspective, and then particularly the perspectives from our different panelists. So thank you very much. And I hand over again to you, Timur. Thanks.
Thanks very much, both of you. Thanks for the very interesting opening remarks. I think this is a very good context setting for the following presentations and discussions. So we could now move to the presentation of the ETP 2020 analysis from my colleagues Thibaut Abergel and Chiara Del Mastro. Thibaut, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Araceli. So the Energy Technology Perspectives 2020 presents a pathway to achieve a net zero emissions energy sector, and the scale of the underlying markets and technology transformation is unprecedented for all sectors: transport, buildings, industry, power, and today we're going to dive into implications for buildings. But first, let's take a step back and look at the political context as the COVID-19 pandemic makes the role of governments more important than ever. In 2019, technologies and policies were off track to achieve climate goals, as Warren mentioned, and today the COVID-19 response could make it change. A growing number of countries are developing economic recovery packages for a short-term boost. And in the meantime, a growing number of countries are also committing to net zero emissions targets, generally by 2050 or 2070, or within the century. So there is an opportunity to combine short-term economic objectives with longer-term net zero commitments. As of the 1st of September of 2020, when we launched the report, roughly 25% of energy-related CO2 emissions were covered by net zero emissions targets, meaning that they occurred in countries that formulated the ambition to reach a net zero emissions energy sector. So 25%, that's already not too bad, and notable efforts should be acknowledged. But this trend could look even more impressive when we look at how dynamic things are, because only 3 months later, as of the 1st of December 2020, our analysis was already outdated. And that's a good news because the share of the global energy-related CO2 emissions that were covered by net zero emissions targets jumped from 25% to 60%. So therefore, there is a real ambition globally, and we see there is raising momentum to reaching net zero emissions. And for the building sector, I wanted to start this presentation with a small poll to understand what it would mean for you, a net zero emissions building sector. So for this, we have a Mentimeter poll. So you're free to open a new web page and go to www.menti.com and enter the passcode 7901633 to understand basically what it means for you a net zero buildings environment. And we have 3 options. The first one, it could mean, for example, net zero for buildings, no more fossil fuels in buildings. So we would get rid of all direct emissions by avoiding the use of fossil fuels for heating and cooking. The second option, and this is the number 2, could be not only no fossil fuel, but also zero carbon electricity and heat, meaning that we are net zero emissions for use phase emissions. So no emissions during buildings operation. A fifth option, sorry, not a fifth, a third option could be not only to include use phase emissions, but also to add to it net zero embodied carbon. So basically no emissions from the buildings construction materials, or at least from the manufacturing of buildings construction materials. So as Roland mentioned in the introduction, these are commonly referred as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. I'll give you a couple of seconds to vote. I see there are a number of votes already coming. And we've got already a winner, although people are continuing to vote. So I'm gonna just wait for 10 more seconds. And we see that this question was actually worth asking because there is actually several answers being picked up. But the winner seems to be that net zero emissions buildings mean not only no use phase emissions, but also includes tackling embodied carbon. And this is the approach we took at the IEA. So for us, net zero emissions buildings will cover not only use phase emissions, but also embodied carbon. So you can continue voting so that we can have a broader perspective about what you think. In the meantime, I'll just continue the presentation. So why we need to focus on embodied carbon and the indirect footprint of the building sector is that, as Roland mentioned and Timur mentioned in the beginning, when taking into account the indirect footprint, we are talking about 40% nearly of global CO2 emissions that would come from buildings. The direct emissions would be only 9%, I would say. And if we add on top the emissions from the electricity use, the share would jump to 28%, to which we need to add an extra 10% for buildings construction industry related to the manufacturing of buildings construction and renovation materials, preeminently steel and cement, but also glass, insulation materials, plastics, different types of petrochemicals, aluminum, etc. So because of the heavy indirect footprint of the building sector, we really want to address the overall value chain emissions. The other thing we need to take into account before designing the strategy is, as Timur mentioned, the legacy of the existing building stock. So here we have a snapshot of the existing building stock by year of construction for different regions in the world. And we can see that in China, India, and other emerging economies, the average age of the building stock is between 12 and 15 years typically. So it's a very young building stock that will remain and continue to be standing through to 2050, for example. So here the share of the 2019 stock that will continue to be standing in 2050 is between 30 and 50%, depending on the emerging economy we're thinking of. But this means that a number of buildings are already built and need to be addressed if we want to reach a net zero emissions energy sector. For advanced economies, other regions in the world like North America, European Union, Japan, Korea, the share is even higher, although the building stock is longer because the age of the existing environment is also higher, and we are assessing that around 60% of the 2019 stock would continue to be standing in 2050. With that, we defined a strategy to achieve net zero emissions, which relies on 3 pillars. The first one, as Timur mentioned, is that there is a number of technologies that is already available today on markets, and we need to deploy them as soon as possible to trigger the necessary economies of scale and emissions reduction, energy savings, and job creation necessary to address both our climate and economic objectives. The second one is to integrate buildings to the entire energy system to address the indirect footprint of buildings, because buildings need to support the transition of other sectors, industry and power, for example, because they account for electricity use in buildings account for 19% of global CO2 emission, and we can add another 10% related to the use of material for construction and renovation. And the third pillar of our strategy, as highlighted in our Clean Energy Innovation Report, is innovation, because despite a number of technologies being available on markets today, we still need to increase efficiency of existing products. We still need to expand the scope of the services provided by the products, and we still need to deploy technologies that are not already on the market today, such as advanced cooling, for example, to meet the climate objectives. So now I leave it with this, and we go through the first point, the deployment of early adoption technologies in light of our sustainable development scenario.
Thank you, Thibault. In this first section, we're going to deep through the energy emissions and technology trends behind our sustainable development scenarios for buildings, focusing on the operational phase of buildings. The sustainable development scenario is the main scenario of the Energy Technology Perspective 2020 publication and illustrate the evolution of the energy sector and related technology needs to reaching global net zero CO2 emissions for the whole energy sector by 2070. The trajectory is compatible with the Paris agreements and also with reaching the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals more related to energy, such as universal access of energy and reduced pollution. As benchmark, the state policy scenario describes the evolution of the energy system on the assumption that existing announced and adopted policies are implemented. This reflects for buildings into emissions peaking in 2019 and reaching net zero soon after 2060. To achieve this, at first, we need to decrease the demand of energy of the buildings, looking at the envelope and also the efficiency of the technologies within the buildings. And we will see in the presentation that we have many opportunities to do so. And second, to decarbonize the consumption which remains within the buildings. For example, with greater uptake of renewables by connecting to clean electricity and its networks, and also by phasing out fossil fuels, of course. We see from the left graphs that the decarbonization of power and heat leads indirect emissions from the electricity and heat used within the buildings to fall even faster than direct CO2 emissions. Both the reduction of buildings demand and greater uptake of renewables in buildings facilitate the decarbonization of power. On the right graph, we see that the European Union is the first to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Dipping into these trends, we see that, next slide, please. We see that some key trends can be highlighted. First is the phase out of fossil fuels, in particular coal and oil decline quite quickly. We see already, especially in developed countries, by 2040. In emerging economies, we have a growth of LPG and oil derivates to 2030 to guarantee universal access to the service, and then is replaced also by other cleaner fuels as bioenergy or electricity. We also see that the inefficient use of traditional biomass for cooking or space heating in emerging economies is also phased out by 2030, while the share of other renewables is growing up to reaching 16% of final energy consumption in buildings by 2070. Two pillars of the transitions are electrification. We see that grows up to reaching 70% of final energy consumption in buildings, driven both by the growing demand for electricity service like space cooling or electric appliances, but also by the greater availability of high efficient electric technologies, for example, thinking about heat pumps or more connected household appliances. Central to the decarbonization of buildings is energy efficiency, especially because in the building sector, compared to other sectors, technologies are available to reduce the demand, the energy demand, while maintaining the same amount of services and the same comfort, which at the end is the first priority of buildings. We see that the energy intensity, so the kilowatt hour per square meters of buildings, is more than halved by 2070. Next, please. In terms of floor area, this means that we need 1/3 of global floor area to reach net zero emissions by 2040, and this is driven by new construction to have a near zero energy buildings as new constructions, and also by deploying deep energy retrofit. To give an idea, we need 4 billion square meters per year to be of buildings to be renovated, which up to 2070, this is equivalent to renovate the whole floor area surface of France. Having better buildings also allows to move from high temperatures to lower temperature systems, which is very important, especially for heating. Heating is a key end use of buildings to be decarbonized, as it now is highly reliant on fossil fuels and is responsible for 45% of buildings' carbon emissions. If we see here that to 2070, 80% of the sales for heating in buildings are represented by heat pumps, district energy, and renewable sources, which are the main drivers of the decarbonization of heat. In particular, heat pumps is becoming the leading technologies in the heating sector as early as 2040. Heat pumps are already mass-produced, but we see an additional potential for innovations, in particular for the enhancement of their applications to several climate contexts, operational needs, and also different building types. Next, please. This morning, we published a commentary entitled "Is Cooling the Future of Heating?", focusing exactly on heat pump applications and enhancement, which can broaden their market, the applicability in other market segments. For example, taking into account areas which with heating only needs, cooling only needs, or both heating and cooling needs. As when reversible, the vapor compression cycles that is common to heat pumps can provide both services. Within the commentary, we have a tool in which you can find indicators related to the share of population which needs high, very high, low, or moderate cooling, heating, or both heating and cooling needs. Associated to these indicators, there are also other indicators related to the market potential for heat pumps and as well to the CO2 savings that can achieved by these technologies compared to conventional alternatives. We see that there is a growing penetration of heat pumps in the heating market, but today the great majority of heat pumps are sold as for space cooling as air conditioners, and most of them are reversible. Space cooling is the growing, fastest growing end user in buildings, and with a rising population, increasing income, and also rising temperatures, we expect this end use to continue to be the faster growing end use in buildings. In particular, we see that the unit equipment for space cooling can grow up to 7 billion, which means more than tripling the equipment that we have today, and is equivalent almost to selling 3 air conditioners every second from now to 2070. In terms of capacity, next slide, please. This means a 4-fold increase in electric capacity installed for space cooling. Here in the graph, we see additional capacity. And of course, we intend these units as to be installed into better buildings, which integrates passive solutions or reflective components. And we also intend these units to be progressively moving towards the best available technologies in terms of efficiency, and also being more flexible, integrated with renewables and with storage. And of course, operating with phasing out high global warming potential refrigerants. To achieve these objectives, there is still a big need of innovations, and momentum is now created by international efforts, just to mention the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program and the Global Cooling Prize. Starting from this innovation potential, we have looked at the synergies between air conditioners and heat pumps, which can accelerate the deployment of more efficient reversible units, especially in the 33% of households worldwide which have both heating and cooling needs. As we see here from the graph, is around 1/4 of the capacity. So we've built our analysis on the fact that technology learning can be transferred across various types of heat pumps and air conditioners. For example, related to new compressor control system, more compact heat exchangers, or refrigerants, and that the growth of cooling needs is the main demand pool for current and future improvements in vapor compression technologies. As we see here, that the output-input capacity of vapor compression cycles can expand more than 5-fold, 85% of which is going to be driven by space cooling. In our sustainable development scenarios, these spillovers or technology transfer across different types of heat pumps and air conditioners can lead to a cost reduction, to a capital cost reduction of reversible units up to 15% by 2050, and this facilitates larger uptakes of reversible units also in the heating market. And we see it as an enabler to having heat pumps as dominant heating equipment by 2050. Now back to Thibaut to see buildings integration within the broader energy system.
Thanks a lot, Chiara. So this was about clean energy deployment, the first pillar, and we are going to dive into the second pillar, integration with other parts of the energy system, starting with power. And before looking at that, let's look at the broader context and explain why this is a must. So electricity demand will be growing in our sustainable development scenario, and this will be met by intermittent resources. So if we're looking at the electricity generation mix today and in the sustainable development scenario through to 2070, we realize that the current capacity met by fossil fuel assets is gradually replaced by low carbon hydro, bioenergy, and nuclear assets to be able to decarbonize electricity generation. But the main trend we see for electricity generation is the rapid ramp up of variable renewables, which dominates the electricity generation mix in 2070 as emissions reach net zero at this year during in our sustainable development scenario. And looking at what is driving this growth, we have, of course, buildings that contribute today to around 55% of global electricity use. This share will be declining through to 2070 with the electrification of transport and industry, but in absolute terms, we see an increase in the electricity use despite energy efficiency gains that are fully tapped into in our sustainable development scenario. So with this growing share, buildings will account for around 20,000 terawatt-hour of electricity use in our sustainable development scenario in 2070, and they hold the responsibility to provide the flexibility services that will enable the accommodation of variable renewables from the electricity generation mix. We analyzed different drivers for electricity demand growth in buildings, and cooling was one of them. So as part of the article that Chiara mentioned, where we see the maps and the synergies between heating and cooling strategies, we also have a dynamic chart that we can play with that shows the average number of air conditioners per household by country relative to income per capita, relative to the year from 1990 to 2070, and also relative to an indicator that will show the impact of climate on air conditioning ownership, the heat index cooling degree days. So basically on this chart, the more to simplify, each bubble represents one country. And if bubbles are blue, bubbles are from blue to red, and blue means a quite cold climate relative to red, which will be a warmer climate. And we see a really rapid growth of air conditioning ownership in emerging economies that are very hot and humid in particular, with the US, China, India, Indonesia, and Brazil being the main air conditioner markets in 2070. So higher efficiency for the technologies combined with passive measures to reduce service needs will contribute to halve electricity demand for cooling relative to baseline trends, our stated policy scenario, sorry. So efficiency is the first lever to address the impact of buildings on electricity systems. But we also looked at when we will actually need this electricity to be consumed and produced by ranking each hour of the year and checking where actually people will need electricity demand in buildings. So we ranked each hour of the year by hours of low variable renewable generation to hours of high variable renewable generation. And here we're showing the cooling load profile in China in 2030. So let's look if we will have some constraints. For commercial cooling, we see that it's quite even across the different hours of the year, but that there is a slight increase in the use of cooling during daytime, which corresponds generally to hours of high variable renewable generation, because basically during hot and sunny days, we have a larger solar PV output, as well as larger commercial cooling needs, which is an opportunity for directly using the solar PV output to power air conditioners. But the story is completely different if we are looking at residential applications, because residential cooling is peaking generally when people come back home and need to cool their house. And this is where we have typically a very low variable renewable generation, which calls for a need for storage and flexibility services to shape this peak. Because the alternative in China in 2030, again, for this analysis, would be to build the equivalent on 150 gigawatts of power just to supply for residential cooling needs during, let's say, less than 5 hours of the time of the year. So cooling storage systems and other flexibility measures are indeed key to address the impact of buildings on power systems. And last, we also analyzed the analysis between the coupling of the transport sector with EVs, electric vehicles, and buildings. So here we're looking at the potential for EV owners, so electric vehicle owners, to come back home and then plug their electric vehicle to a charger that will discharge the electricity remaining in the battery, discharge it to the grid to power their home, for example, power their appliances, meet their thermal needs, for their neighborhood or the electricity grid, to be able to shape the peak. And we are mentioning this sector coupling between transport and buildings because when people come back home, the electric vehicle is also at home. So it means that basically there is a nice synergy that could be found between transport and buildings to mitigate the impact of the decarbonization strategy on power systems upgrades, on power system upgrade needs. So here the vehicle-to-grid potential was assessed, and we see that there is quite a huge gap between peak capacity needs and off-peak capacity needs that could be narrowed. So first, let's deduct the variable generation from variable renewables. And here we see that this contributes to only increase the gap, because variable renewable typically generate electricity during off-peak hours, unfortunately. But the potential for vehicle-to-grid is up to 600 gigawatts distributed across the main EV markets, and 600 gigawatts, for those of you who are familiar with the power system or the electricity sector, it represents nearly half of current hydropower capacity, which is basically the main asset that we use today to match electricity demand and supply at any time. So this means that electric vehicles, with the adoption rates compatible with our sustainable development scenario, could unlock half of the current potential by 2030 already. So we thought it would be worth highlighting what's the upper boundary for this potential. After how much of this will be tapped into, it's another question, but at least the potential is there. And I invite you to read the Global Electric Vehicle Outlook if you want to know more under the underlying assumptions. So this was a quick, brief snapshot about our analysis and the integration of buildings with power systems. And without further delay, let's move on to another area where buildings will need to break historical silos and support the transition of another sector. And I'm talking about material manufacturing industries here. So why is that? Because embodied emissions, or the emissions from the manufacturing of buildings construction materials, have increased a lot over the past 2 decades. We are here mainly focusing on steel and cement, since they represent more than half of total embodied emissions. So here you can see the embodied emissions related to cement and steel, and we see more than a doubling for steel, and an increase by more than 50% for cement just over the past 20 years. And the main driver for this growth was floor area. Floor area that expanded quite dramatically between 2000 and 2019. In China, for example, we added 30 billion square meters. So it doesn't mean anything, but that's today's surface built of the United States. So we basically added the surface of the United States to China over the past 20 years. And this has contributed, of course, to dramatically increase the embodied emissions related to cement and steel manufacturing globally. And since 2015, it's true that construction rates in China have leveled off, perhaps declining slightly depending on the years. But basically, the increase has been taken over by other emerging economies, such as, for example, India or Indonesia or Brazil, which are now taking the lead in driving up these emissions. Building frames and height are other contributors, and we see that the contributors, the contribution of factors that contribute to increase the embodied emissions is largely exceeding the efforts on the industry, on the industry side, on the material manufacturing side. Despite their effort, it didn't manage to offset the contribution of the growth of floor area, building frames and height on embodied emissions. Construction activity fell in the wake of the pandemic. That's true, and especially in China, for example, housing completions decreased by 15% nearly on the January to April 2020 period relative to the January to April 2019 period. And we estimated that on average for the year, we will see around a decrease of around 5% of construction activity in China. But this number can be higher in some parts of the world, for example, in Europe. In April 2020, Europe recorded a decline of 25% of construction activity compared to April 2019, and average across the year. In some countries, here we see France and the UK, for example, we see a decline rate of 2 digits, so lower than 10%. These are estimates, of course, because it's 2020 data. This still needs to be refined, but it's just to give you an order of magnitude that actually we think that embodied emissions may decrease by 5% annually in 2020 relative to 2019. and that this 5%, it's actually less than the average annual growth rate of embodied emissions over the past 20 years. So still not on track with the pandemic. Embodied carbon is even harder to abate than use phase emissions. At least this is how this was presented in the report. Since we had a decline of direct emissions from buildings, coal, oil, and natural gas, for example, by I think more than 50% by 2040, as Kara highlighted in the trends for the sustainable development scenario. Electricity and heat is declining even faster. And for cement and steel manufacturing, it's also declining, but at a much slower rate, which is why the contribution of cement and steel manufacturing to total buildings and construction emissions is increasing, starting from, I think, 18% today to more than 40% throughout the modeling period. Which means that this is something where material efficiency strategies, so reduction in the use of material for buildings construction and renovation, can really play a huge role so that it alleviates the burden placed on the material manufacturing industries. And we've quantified this potential. So here, sustainable action needs to be stimulated along the value chains because material efficiency strategies contribute to around a third of the total reduction of emissions by 2070 in the sustainable development scenario relative to the stated policy scenarios. This is what you see in the colors here. The trajectory follows an uneven path, knowing that the contribution of material efficiency strategies increases quite rapidly through to 2050 before saturating because of the contribution of lifetime extension, of which renovation is key. And by 2050, basically, most of the existing building stock is renovated under our scenario, meaning that the impact of renovation is not growing anymore after 2050. That's why we have this uneven path. But we've looked at the overall building's life cycle, taking into account the whole life approach, starting at the design phase, for example, with strategies like structural optimization, innovative designs, composite framing, for example, as well as prefabrication, precasting, use phase with building repurposing, for example, to extend the building's lifetime and avoid tearing buildings down to rebuild it after, because construction companies actually told us that a renovation would require 40 to 80 times less materials or less resources in mass than tearing a building down and building it again. And we've also looked at the end of life of buildings, so managing waste, reuse, recycling, using digital tools all along these processes to increase and tap into the full material efficiency potential to come up with a whole value chain and life cycle strategy, hopefully. So now let's move on to the third pillar on innovation with Chiara.
Thank you. In our reports, we've seen that innovation plays a strong role to the transition to net zero emissions. The good news for buildings, next slide, okay, is that is going to be the reduction of emissions is going to be driven by technologies that we already have in the market. In particular, 70% of the cumulative emissions reduction from the sustainable development scenarios to the stated policy scenarios can be achieved by technologies that are already market available, with a progressively increasing role of early adoption technologies. The remaining 30% of emission reduction will still require innovation, for example, thinking about integrating active components within the building envelope, which will allow to generate energy exploiting the whole surface of the buildings and not just the rooftop, or, for example, thinking about flexibility options and storage integration. Next, please. to support this analysis, we developed a guide, the ETP Clean Energy Technology Guide, which maps over 400 individual technologies and components designs within a framework which is interactive. And for each technology, you can, of course, see the description of the technology, the level of maturity, indication on the role we see it may play to reach net zero emissions, and also indications of leading actors and initiatives in the field, and deployment targets if available. For buildings, we described around more than 100 technologies. Here you see the 4 categories, so construction and renovation, heating and cooling, lighting, and integration with power system. And of course, this is aggregated into several, the 100 technologies. Next, please. Coming back again to heat pumps, we have seen before that there are still potential enhancement, and that technology learning across the different types of woes can really accelerate the deployment of technologies which are still in the innovation pipelines. Especially, we see 4 major areas for enhancements for these technologies. First is to tailor heat pumps to specific market segments and operation conditions. For example, thinking about cold climate heat pumps, or heat pumps to be deployed within multifamily buildings where there are a variety of demands, or also as part as renovation packages. Second is to enhance the integration of heat pumps within the other parts of the energy systems, for example, with the electricity grid through demand and response, or the integration with storage, with renewable assets, for example, with solar or other renewables, and also within low temperature district energy systems. So, for example, thinking about district heating and cooling networks. Third is to improve heat pumping technologies operations, for example, to having them operating efficiently at partial loads, or also to be able to simultaneously produce both cooling and heating. And last point is to develop innovative solutions for cooling, which can address specific areas such as hot and humid countries, for example, through hybrid components, as an example. Next slide, please. Broader on the building sectors, we identified 3 areas in which innovation can deliver benefits. First is to deploy packaged multi-service solutions, which can enable to exploit the synergies which that different technologies combined can deliver. For example, thinking at the standardization of some process, or for example, the standardization of renovation models. And this can deliver improved performances, and also have a necessary cost reduction to have these clean energy technologies deployed. Second is to integrate different end uses. So, for example, to exploit the synergies which several end uses can provide when combined. For example, thinking about using the waste heat from the air conditioners to produce hot water, or also to combine heating and cooling networks. And the third one we have already seen previous slides is to deliver solutions which are tailored to several local conditions which are available in our building stocks. So, for example, considering the different building types, the different climates, but also the different social conditions of the people and operational pathways. And of course, this also has a more broader view of on planning. Next, please. As many governments has also pledged to reach net zero emissions as early as 2050, we checked whether this was feasible with innovation alone in the faster innovation case. In this case, we see that is needed an accelerated in deployment of early adoption technologies, but also accelerated innovation cycles to have new and emerging technologies within our market in the next 40 years. All these considerations are deepened into the special reports of on clean energy innovations, which is part of the energy technology perspective series. And here we just focus on buildings for this. So for buildings, we deep our attentions on the innovation needs to limit the climate impacts of the rise of space cooling and refrigeration demand. We did this through an accelerated deployment of a combination of efficiency gains in vapor compression technologies. So, for example, let's think at what is called advanced vapor compression, for example, with which integrates refrigerant controls or a new compressor which can operate more efficiently with low global warming potential refrigerants. But in this case, we also accelerate the deployment of alternative solutions to the vapor compression cycles as soon as 2030, such as, for example, looking at solid state technologies, membranes, coupled with desiccants or evaporative cooling, and an accelerated integration within cold storage, and also an accelerated change in the use of refrigerants. As seen before, we also in this case, we see that the faster demand growth of advanced cooling technologies and technology learning can benefit technology development on for heating services. And in this case is amplified and also speed the decarbonization of the power sector, leading at the results that we see in the slide. So to conclude, next, please. 5 key points for conclusions. We've seen that is very critical to tackle emissions from the existing buildings. Buildings, as Thibaut said in the beginning, have very long lives cycles, and many of buildings that we already have today will still stand in the future. So it's going to be very important to decarbonize those and to deploy deep retrofit policies for those. Second is to strengthen the market for clean energy technologies at the early stage of adoption. We've talked a lot about this before. So to governments needs to incentivize and accelerate the deployment of these technologies, and in particular, it's very important that the cost of these technologies is the cost gap is reduced compared to traditional technologies. And for this, there are several market pool instruments which are available, but also there is additional needs for research and development also when this technology starts to be adopted. Third is to develop and upgrade infrastructure that enables technology development. All these clean technologies that we've mentioned before in buildings, but also in the whole energy systems, are not coming alone, and requires associated infrastructures, which might require upgrades or also new investments to deliver new ones. Let's think, for example, to smart grids or with new connected appliance connectivity of appliances, which will require several infrastructures. Or also, let's think about district energy networks, district heating networks, which now operate at high temperatures and will be required to move to lower temperature operation and integrate with cooling network. Fourth, is to boost support for research, development, and demonstration to enable additional innovation to penetrate the market. In particular, we've seen in our report to the importance of smart modular technologies for this, and also on this point, important is to make sure that the knowledge developed during this research is also can be shared in order to benefit other areas of the system. And last point is to enable and increase international collaboration along the whole material and energy value chains, for example, thinking at the exchange of policies, best practices, or the standardization and harmonization of standards and codes, or also the deployment of platform where knowledge can be exchanged between different countries and institutions. So thank you very much. Move to Q&A session.
Thanks very much, both Thibaut and Chiara, for the comprehensive presentation. We are getting a few questions. I think the best thing would be if we could hold for 2-3 minutes so that we give the chance to all participants to put their questions either on the question box within the GoToWebinar window or within the chat box as well. Then we can compile all of them and structure them so that we can address them in, let's say, around 15 minutes or so. We'll have not to run too late. So we'll hold for a minute, and so please post your questions. I've just indicated a couple of messages responding to some more general questions around whether the slide deck would be available. So we'll make the presentation available at the IEA website, and we'll inform all participants so they can download those materials. And of course, as well, the full ETP 2020 report is fully available on our website, as well as the Clean Energy Innovation Special Report and the Clean Energy Technology Guide tool that was described, presented by Chiara. And as well, as of today, as of this morning, you can also read the new commentary that has been also authored by the two colleagues here, Thibaut and Chiara, that has also, as is shown now in the screen, thanks. So has all these interactive maps that can help understand some of these trends in terms of the regional differences when we look at cooling and demand, cooling and heating demand, sorry, and at the same time the synergies, as my colleagues explained, that have good potential to be exploited in terms of technology development moving forward. So we'll leave perhaps just a screen so people can look at that, and as I've mentioned, we'll hold for a couple of minutes to compile the questions. So we'll be right back. Thanks very much. Okay, well, welcome back. Thanks again for all the questions. We are getting quite some questions. We are gonna try to address at least 3 or 4, depending on how much time this gives us, and then we'll make sure that all the questions that you raise can be addressed separately by email, so we don't leave any question unresolved. Let me start by a question on related to the presentation by Thibaut around the integration of buildings in power systems. So the colleague was indicating that in the presentation we've mentioned around 150 gigawatt overcapacity of renewables if seasonable imbalances in cooling and heating needs are to be covered. And so whether we could elaborate on this and also how or show that specific slide and how we could resolve that problem. So if Thibaut perhaps can elaborate a bit further on that aspect, please.
Thanks, Rosalie. Indeed, there are a couple of solutions that are, some of which are scalable to address this imbalance between cooling needs and renewable generation capacity. So here, the 150 gigawatts represent the difference between the peak capacity here and I would say the average of peak capacity. And among the solutions that can be used to address this imbalance, we could have individual solutions, for example, compact system with, I mean, for example, ice storage in the case of cooling solutions, or heat battery if we were to do this analysis for heating as well. For this, there are a number of research projects, a number of prototype products that are being developed, some of which part of our technology collaboration programs on heat pumping technologies. So I remember there is one annex looking at a comfort and climate box for different countries and climate zones, for example. So trying to test prototypes for, I would say, cold or temperate countries with little space in the apartment, for example, or space constraints at least. So trying to develop a compact product that could be flexible, integrate digital tools that would learn from people's behavior and also respond accordingly to signals from the electricity provider. So one for cold climates and another for hot and humid climates. I mean, based on the analysis that we showed, because space cooling demand is obviously going to be driving this imbalance in these countries. We could look also at more collective solutions, I would say. So, for example, integrated heat pumps in district energy networks. And I take this opportunity to also answer another question on, did you consider the integration of heat pumps in district energy networks? And sure, we did. We looked at how we could best use heat pump operations, so taking into account not only the effect, I mean, the production of heat, but also of cooling from the evaporator, for example, and the compressor to provide heating and cooling to different districts. So, for example, commercial districts may have higher cooling needs to cool office appliances, while residential districts might have more heating needs to heat houses. So here we can have some efficiency gains by integrated heat pumps into district and low carbon district energy systems. Power to heat is of course an option, especially as district energy systems could serve as a means to store energy. And in terms of the seasonal imbalance, we also are considering, for example, ground source storage. And actually there was one interesting project that was picked up by one of our initiatives called Today in the Lab, Tomorrow in Energy. This project was called Bringing the Heat of the Summer into the Winter through ground source storage. So I would invite you to have a look at the webpage. We have a dedicated webpage on this project if you want to know more about these technologies.
Thanks, Thibaut. I think this resolves some of the, I mean, there were a few questions around that topic, so I think that's helpful. Thanks. There was another question around our scenarios in terms of the scope of behavioral changes in our analysis for the scenarios behind ETP. So if you could perhaps, Chiara, touch on that, please.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Behavior in building is extremely important. There is plenty of literature at the moment saying that the same building in similar climates, but with different occupants, can have a consumption with differ up to more than 50%. So in our scenarios, we couldn't really take into account the occupants opening and closing the windows, but we assumed that occupants where behavior was aligned to technology needs. For example, acting on set point temperatures, which of course we see comfort conditions, but reasonable set point temperatures. And also we assume of behavior change in the sense of shift towards more efficient and cleaner technologies. On another hand, we also assume that digitalization and smart technologies, as well as improved buildings, will help guarantee these comfort conditions without requiring too many actions from the occupants as is today. Of course, the behavior aspects also links to the awareness of consumers and the educations and the trainings to who install the technologies to make sure that is installed correctly and the user can operate in it correctly, and additional policy efforts is needed in these directions. And we will have a section in our panel discussion later focused exactly on this topic, so please stay tuned there.
Thanks, Chiara, very helpful. There's another kind of couple of questions related to the embodied carbon in buildings, so more related to the discussion on the transition in the manufacturing of materials, touching on the fact that we expect quite a big or the large share of the demand globally for materials to come from let's say developing countries that could have more challenges to get access and to deploy clean energy technologies for the manufacturing of those materials that would help the transition of the industrial sector. And so I think there were some questions around, you know, which extent we've considered these aspects. And so indeed, in our scenarios, I mean, there's different mechanisms that are key. So having an affordable access of clean energy technologies throughout the different regions to basically support or help the development and the deployment of these technologies is key. So there's a lot of discussions around technology transfer and how those kind of technology spillovers that were referred to in the presentation, but in the buildings context, but that apply across the whole energy system can be further stimulated. So this is actually something where we've discussed in much more detail in the clean energy or in the special report on clean energy innovation, where we've explored a more detailed, let's say, policy toolkit that could be tailored to specific technologies, depending on what the stage of development they were in the innovation process, but also in which context they would be applied. And perhaps the other aspect to highlight here is that there are two components or the two projects and programs so from the IEA that could be interesting in this respect, because there was a specific mention to CCUS technologies because of the high relevance in the in materials manufacturing. And so we also released a special report on CCUS and the role of that technology family in clean energy transitions. And in there, again, there's much more in-depth discussion on specific policy toolkit that could allow or would support the development of those technologies to markets and the introduction in markets and the deployment in the different types of applications and in different regional contexts. And the other aspect that I thought was useful for the audience to know related to this question was about the program that the IEA has been running for some years now, which is called the Clean Energy Transitions Program, in which we provide support through analysis, through policy recommendations, through the organization of trainings and workshops, etc., with or to emerging economies, basically to help them kind of progress and advance in these transitions, and help also stimulate technology transfer from developed countries to emerging economies in some cases as well. So yeah, just wanted to bring those two things to the mind of colleagues. And I see there's some more questions coming in. So we will make sure we can group them and get back to you separately by email as needed. Just in the interest of time, we may need to move now, I think, to the panel discussion to make sure that we can have enough time for discussion and we give the chance to our excellent speakers to share their views and have their exchange. So just wanted to thank again Thibaut and Chiara for the very good presentation, and colleagues for all the questions. And as I said, we'll make sure we'll get back to you on the remaining questions. Thanks again, and I'll pass it now on to Thibaut and Chiara to run the panel discussions.
Yes, thank you very much, Araceli. We are going to, in this panel discussion, we're going to discuss how to accelerate the transitions towards sustainable buildings, and we're going to look in, by different perspectives of our great speakers. Please turn on your camera when mentioning your name. So we have here already Henk Kranenberg, which is a senior manager at the Environmental Research Center Dike in Europe and the vice president at Eurovent board. He has great experience on energy performance of buildings and indoor air quality, energy-related products legislation, F-gas legislation, standardization issues on products and building systems, and also safety and sound restriction for appliances. Welcome, Henk, to the discussion. We have Cécile Foreau, who leads the Clean Construction Program at C40, the network of world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. Her team supports cities in reducing embodied carbon and shifting the construction sector towards a decarbonized, just and inclusive future. She advocates for a whole life and circular approach to our built environment. Looking forward to hear from you. We have Luca De Giovanetti, which is Manager Science-Based Targets at the World Building Council for Sustainable Development. He leads the decarbonization work streams, part of the Transforming the Built Environment project, aimed at accelerating the achievement of net zero emissions across the entire built environment life cycles through system-wide collaboration. Luca is also part of a Science-Based Target Initiative Technical Advisory Group, as well as the Net Zero Expert Advisory Group. Hi, Luca, welcome. And Dr. Tianzhen Hong is a senior scientist and the deputy head of the Building Technologies Department of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in the USA. He leads the Urban System Group and a team of researchers looking at technologies and strategies as human behaviors to improve energy efficiency, demand flexibility, and the climate resilience of both individual and urban buildings. He is very active in the scientific community, being ASHRAE fellows and also participating to several annexes of the Energy and Buildings and Community Technology Collaboration Program. So welcome everybody to these panel sections, and we can start the discussion with the first poll.
Exactly, thanks, Chiara. So the question we are going to try to provide answers to is how to accelerate the transition to zero emissions buildings. And for this, we'd like first to collect views on the audience on what are the key enablers to the decarbonization of buildings. So to submit your answers and help a bit our panelists to focus on things that matter to you, you can rank these key enablers on a scale from 1 to 5 by using the same link as before. You just need to refresh the page, and I see some answers coming in already. And so basically, you can go to this and type the code or refresh the page and vote. And then we'll see some views from the audience. And here we can see that both policies and regulations and value chain interactions, or actually technology now, are quite key enablers according to you, with consumer empowerment also ranking 2.5 out of 5. So not too bad. Policies and regulations seems to be taking the lead. Give a couple of 10 additional seconds for final answers to be entered. So I think now the results are stabilizing. So we have a clear winner with policies and regulations as the key enabler. So I'd suggest we start with this question, perhaps with you, Cécile, with a policy expert. And so according to you, how could policy and regulations best facilitate the transition? So both to address the embodied carbon as your manager for this program, but also as you have a number of colleagues working on use phase emissions. So how could they contribute to actually lower buildings use phase and embodied emissions?
Thank you, Thibault, and thank you to everyone for having me on this great session. It's been very informative. There is many ways city can look at policies and regulation, and it varies very much depending on which context, country they are sitting in. So maybe one thing to first mention is that we at C40 have two declarations that are really looking at this whole life approach. The first one is a net zero building declaration, which was launched at GCAS in September 2018 in strong collaboration with the World Green Building Council. Sorry, too many GBC acronyms over. And it has now more than 100 signatories, including 26 cities, 6 regions, and 66 businesses. And it set targets for 2030 of net zero carbon new building by 2030, net zero carbon for all building by 2050, plus an extra addition that most C40 city signatories have opted to take, which is basically on owning and occupying. Sorry, I'm reading because I don't want to mess it up. So they have signed on own, occupy and develop only net zero carbon municipal building by 2030. So that's really a way that city can take action on what they have direct control of. We have some number of examples. So on new building, some of leading cities are Vancouver, implementing zero emission building plans with bylaws and other regulation for new buildings. Carbon neutral city buildings and program including energy benchmarking for existing buildings. We would also give a shout out to South African cities that are developing policies and bylaws based on regulation for new buildings, really. New York is a great example of a leading city that looks at existing buildings and retrofits, and potentially doing so on developing local interactive maps, and therefore demonstrating how buildings are performing, which is one of the key barriers, if we mention that at some point. Copenhagen is doing great on its municipal stock, for instance. But that's all on the energy aspect, the operational use of building. Another way now that we have complemented these efforts in terms of policy is really looking at the embodied emission and the clean construction aspect of things. And for that, we've launched in November the Clean Construction Declaration. It was a difficult year to launch anything new frontier like that, because it's not in direct control of cities. It's not data that they have. They do not report under their immediate emission inventories. Yet we have 4 cities who sign up, well, the initial cities signing up to this, and because I have only 4, I can give you the name of them because it gives a range, and it's Budapest, Los Angeles, Mexico City, and Oslo. So you can see the diversity of type and scale and geographies of these cities. And there, the innovation is really to look at collective targets, and I'm sure Luca will mention that later. On construction, collaboration is critical. Having the whole value chain, understanding the direction of travel and how each of their action can fit to reach these targets is critical. And what policies, what cities are doing with this Clean Construction Declaration is really to set the tone, the direction of travel. Where do they want to go by 2030? When we talk about C40 cities, one thing to note is that we talk about leadership cities. So city wants to be at the leadership of climate action. We do recognize that it's not for all cities necessarily to want to take such a leadership position. But these collective targets, therefore, that they're setting are to reduce embodied emission by 50% by 2030 on new building, major retrofit, and all infrastructure projects. And to strive to aim really to get to at least 30% by 2025. And the proximity of the target, really looking at 2025 to 2030, is critical to help put things into motion. It's really fascinating and really important to see the whole life, the whole pathway towards full decarbonization, as you did earlier. But I think it's important for cities, especially with their political mandate, to take action now in the next 5-10 years to really set things into motion right now. The last thing that I would say, to let everyone talk, apologies, is that we have a Clean Construction Policy Explorer, which really looks at the type of policies, strategies, pilots that cities are taking to look at policy and regulation changes. And I would put the link maybe on the chat, if that's okay, so you can all have a look at this Explorer and let us know if anything is missing.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Cécile. Feel free to post all the resources you've mentioned in the chat so that people can actually look at them by themselves, because I think it's very important to bring cities in the dialogue and brings a very nice complement to the government's net zero emissions target that we presented, but actually cities are key level to addressing these. That's why their involvement is really essential. Is there any reaction immediate from other panelists on the policy and regulatory aspects? Maybe no more than 1 minute by complements to be able to tackle all the questions we have after.
I just want to emphasize really the importance of policy to really enable and accelerate the market transformation that is needed. So policy plays an important role to really create the acceleration of the action that are required. So more than that, I think we already know enough about that.
Okay, thanks. And I think this is quite shared among the audience, because policies and regulation ranked 4.6 out of 5. So we see that 16 people voted 5 out of 5. So I think it's quite clear that policies need to be in place to trigger this transition. But so is technology, consumer empowerment, and value chain interactions, which are quite important to other people as well. So perhaps we can move to another topic with Chiara now.
Yeah, let's talk about consumers. They live in our buildings and also in our cities, and they're the core of technology choices, and also they do interact with this technology, so they strongly impact the energy needs of the buildings. So we would like to hear how consumers can be empowered to participate in the building's energy transition. And also we have another poll for the audience to prioritize 4 measures. Awareness raising, peer-to-peer energy trading, demand-side response, and energy service companies. So we look forward to your input in ranking those. In the meantime, while we are waiting, just remember to the code is the same as before. Again, logging into the Menti platform 7901633. We start to receive first answers. Demand side response first at the moment, awareness raising second. Interesting. It's changing quickly. Now awareness raising is first and demand side response second, but almost okay, the race. And it seems peer-to-peer energy trading now to be quite stable in these positions. Okay. interesting answer. So maybe we can hear more on the topic from Tianzheng. How do you think that the consumers can be empowered to participate to the building energy transition?
Thanks, everyone. I'm very happy to be on the panel. Yeah, indeed. I think it's a very interesting and important topic. Just looking at the survey, results, the demand side response is ranked as #1. I think it's very interesting. This year 2020 is a challenge for everybody, but we actually globally have a few data points very interesting that shows during the pandemic, right? Most of people staying at home, and we see the essential sector energy increase about 10%, which is a surprise, right? Because most of us are spending time at home, much more time. And on the other side, the commercial building, like office building, right? We see, the reduction is also, only average about 10 to 15%. A big surprise, because if you look at most of these buildings, the occupancy is really low, like 5%, maybe almost, 30%. But the energy reduction is not, right, on that order. Most of those buildings are still consuming from 70% to 90% of energy. So I think this data point actually, provides, lots of insights into the way we design, operate our buildings. Yeah, so I think from the human factor perspective, lots of data shows, it's an important factor. And actually, IEA, the EBC, has 3 annex, starting in 2008, Annex 53, and then Annex 66, and ongoing Annex 79. We're trying to look at from the occupants' perspective, how they use energy and how they can influence the way they consume energy, and not only just the total amount, but also when they use energy. And I think earlier the report mentioned the demand flexibility, becomes a key issue, right? If you're talking about decarbonizing the buildings, sector. So yeah, so 3 points I would just briefly mention. One is the purchase behavior. So how we, motivate consumers to purchase, energy efficient, appliances, rooftop PVs, electric vehicles, and heat pump, right, which is critical for heating and cooling, decarbonization. So I think that is an area, right, the policies and incentive rebate, those kind of programs, can help, to motivate consumers to do those kind of energy efficient purchase. And one of the key things is look at the life cycle cost perspective, right? This is a very interesting point, because most of those energy efficient equipment can be a little bit expensive, at the first cost. But if you look at life cycle cost perspective, usually they are, much better. The second point is about energy use behavior. So if we talk about occupants, right, how they use behavior, I think earlier mentioned, right, it's a comfort. And comfort is diverse and dynamic, and I think most of the comfort standards are very narrow, and which is not necessarily true, and which is also conflict with the way we want to conserve energy, right? So and I think occupants need to be aware of this. Use free cooling measures as possible, like use the open windows for natural ventilation, use of ceiling fans, portable fans, to provide comfort before they turn to mechanical cooling. So those kind of awareness and building design technology to enable that, I think is critical. And so also behaviors like if you don't need energy, right? If you don't need lighting, for example, you are leaving a room, you should turn the lights off and turn the air conditioning off, or at least reset the heating and cooling temperatures. So those are the simple things that consumers can do to reduce energy waste. And the last thing I want to mention is the education, training, and communication. I think this point is very important, earlier already mentioned. And I just want to emphasize we should start these early, for the kindergarten or even elementary school students, to help, cultivate this kind of green energy, lifestyle from the very beginning, of everybody's life. I will stop here.
Thank you very much for raising all these very interesting points, and especially also for highlighting the importance of data and data points to better understand the behavior of consumer. Any other comments from the rest of the panelists? Okay, so
just quickly add, sorry, Chiara, just quickly add that there is clearly a lack of understanding from maybe a wider public stand, especially on the issue of clean construction, which doesn't really help consumers, well, the main actors within the sector to take significant action, because the demand side is not fully there from a wider public perspective, even though cities, for instance, as occupiers and owners can stimulate this demand, there was a wider need basically for mainstreaming that to other occupiers and tenants and wider public awareness.
thank you. Other comments?
Also, I mean, also sorry.
So one of the challenges, like energy is something invisible. Right? There needs to be technology or communication to make energy use visible. I think that's a critical step. Yeah.
The challenge is also the importance of understanding that users would probably not drive their decision on energy or carbon as a first choice. So there is other aspects that are on the top of the mind of users. So we need to make sure that it's easy for them to not only do choices based on this aspect, but actually that make it simple, that they don't even have to choose on that, but the solution are provided to them. So, and that's obviously links to cost and regulation that are kind of where the aspect can support their measures. So yeah.
Thank you, very interesting point. Maybe we can move to the next questions with Thibaut.
Yeah, I think it's a great point from Luca to make the transition with the technology aspects, because the technologies not only need to provide efficient services, but also be purchased by the consumers and then need to interact with the consumers in a user-friendly way. So there is also some technology aspects within this behavioral component. And here we are very fortunate to have with us Henk from Daikin. So Henk, when we say, for example, that technologies are available to decarbonize buildings, but that we see that there are remaining innovation needs. Do you agree with this statement? And how would you see the transformation of the market being to achieve climate goals as part of Daikin?
I think in our view, I will give some answers to the questions that could possibly help. The good news I want to mention indeed today is that the technology is available. And of course, we also need innovation, but too often, and that I also see in daily practice, people are waiting too long for an innovation and not adopting existing technology, which can already be a leap ahead. So technology is available. But what is key, and it's already addressed by more panelists, is the route to the market. How are people getting trust, getting confidence that we are doing the right things? And in fact, if we want to decarbonize our society by 2050, it means key driver, in fact, would be decarbonization. And so far, and I'm from the European side more, but I have some contacts, of course, in the worldwide scene. Then, for example, we have in Europe, and already discussed on ISO level as well, we have a European set of energy performance standards on buildings, which is also now within the ISO 52000 series. Perhaps I should raise a question. Does anybody know? Perhaps this could be a question for the Mentimeter. But this is something which is energy related. And in fact, we do not only discuss on energy, no, we are discussing on decarbonization. And this factor in itself is in fact failing within these standards. And if we want to give trust to the people, why they should take a heat pump, for example, to stay close to Daikin, why they should take a heat pump, then they should also be, they should be sure that if I invest make the money investment in it, it will suit my building, it will suit me, I will have the right comfort. So in many aspects, they have questions that have to be answered. And to give this trust, I think this step towards the standards is a very important one. It should be adopted far more also by member states to really make it tangible. If you are investing money in your house, your residential building, could be an office building, whatever, the hospital, then at least I'm sure I'm in line with the right things, I'm doing the right things, and perhaps some innovations will come up in the future, and I will address that point later on. But already with today's available technology, we can do an awful lot of things, as we can see around us already. But it means we have to build up trust. We have to reward the people that can see, yes, if I'm making this step ahead, if I'm using, for example, in coming years or in Europe already European standards, or in future these ISO standards, I'm in line with experts agreed on that, and also the member state I'm living in or the country I'm living in is rewarding such a process. So decarbonization should be the key driver, and it is not today. Today, although there are some other calculations, mathematics, to find out what is then the decarbonization itself, it is always a next step. But the focus is on energy performance. Within Europe, we clearly see we have all kinds of energy directives and regulations, energy efficiency, energy-related products, energy efficiency, performance of buildings. So we have a full scale out of directives and regulation, and legislation, but it's all focusing on energy. So I can understand all the, basically your own presentation, which I like very much. And that first of all, but you also have a lot of slides just showing the electricity, but not the direction to decarbonization. So this is also a mindset we have to work on. So that is the first point I would like to raise. And if this trust is there, then you also end up in financing and business models that are going to reward. Because if you know I'm going to invest in something which is properly giving confidence and trust, and if there is a grant in a country, some certain subsidy program, but I will even be rewarded by that because I'm fulfilling these requirements, it is all getting much more tangible. And then you also will get more financing and business models, which could be as a kind of a service. I think Yara already referred to that. You could have this comfort as a service, or heating or cooling as a service. But all these kind of models, because we all know, well, we have a huge investment in front of us and how to overcome this bridge. And I see many, many studies, many projects, pilot projects, but not a major breakthrough in that field. And I think also you need first to have this trust in order to get the financing and the business models reflecting it. And then you can also make the next steps. Like today in the building, we can already make a building carbon neutral. That is, we have proven already. We did many study projects, Germany, in the UK, and Portugal. We even have projects which are going further, not just one building, but even have a region of residential houses or even several office buildings. By the way, these latter projects were also funded by NIDO. Can also be found back some information on that on the NIDO website. And then you see we go from product to a more system to a more urban region integration. And then we also need smart technology. That is a key. We have smart technologies inside products, and we're driving already top-notch efficiency and decarbonization on the product level. But we have to go wide. If we want to have a smart city, where also Cecile already referred to, we need more information, and we have to collaborate in that field. And how? So if we want to run our heat pump again, we need electricity. But if you already know, we have already 1,000 houses here. In fact, we don't have to run 1,000 heat pumps because of some of them are sufficiently heated already. There's no need of domestic hot water. So we may switch off even for 15 minutes, 500 out of them. So immediately we know this is available capacity, which the network operator will know as well. And you can therefore within this system play with availability and demand of, so that's typically demand response type of systems. there is technology available, all at different pieces within the market. But the factor of collaboration, and I think that is also where cities can interact, and cities should take a technology neutral position in that. I think, okay, we have already a municipal incineration, and therefore we have to deliver some heat to some buildings, and that is guiding my policy. No, this should be technology neutral, and look what is available in the marketplace. They should act much more as the system integrator in the market. Which brings me also then to another point. Yeah, perhaps now it's a lot in a nutshell, but I think good to mention, and it was already mentioned also by Chiara, talking about district heating and the high temperature systems, where I think a clear warning on that I would like to make is, let's take care not to have lock-in effects, that we are investing too long on systems where we know they are supplied with energy which will not be renewable by 2050. If we are going to a circular economy, in fact, we should not have any waste incineration anymore. We may have other waste heat from other sources, but let's not consider the current waste incinerations for supplying heat to a district heating at high temperature. This will not be sustainable for a long time. So we have to be very careful on that. And I think district heating can be a very good solution, but make it again technology neutral. Take care that we are not relying too much on one source, that perhaps we are even shareholder in such a municipal incineration. But to give an example, but it is open to new technologies. Like in the future, it was already clearly explained how important cooling will be within the buildings. So by having these low temperature networks, you can supply both heating and cooling. So even if you have 40 degrees of water through your piping system, you can have both heating and cooling. But thanks to then decentralized heat pumps you use at within an apartment building to make domestic hot water. And you can still use the 40 degrees, for example, temperature, or 35 or whatever, but not the high temperature. Go to the low temperature regions in order to facilitate much more functionality. But this means also a major change in mind. I used the word already a couple of times. It is very much about a mind shift. So we have to first, to summarize in fact what I mentioned, is we have to focus on the right drivers, and that's decarbonisation. That's not only energy neutrality, no, it's decarbonization. And secondly, create the landscape to make projects feasible, where municipalities can have an important role. There should be the system integrators of all, and they have to take care that we are doing the right investments. So where other and also innovations, because I do not say, and that's perhaps an important remark at the end, innovations will continue and will keep on to continue. Otherwise, simply our business will die out as well. It will continue to go with innovations. But these future innovations should be addressable also in future systems. So if you have lock-in effects now, which avoid certain innovations for the future, then I think we are not working on a sustainable way, and we have to avoid that. So innovations will definitely continue, but let's take care that we are all investing in such a way that we have a technology neutral open landscape for the future as well. So perhaps so far, so I think I used my 5 minutes of time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Henk. It's a very great overview, and I really like the way how you combine the three questions we asked on end users, on regulations, and on technology to answer them, all of them. So very, very good. Perhaps we can move to the last question, Chiara.
Yes, to close with the full chain of the building, so going back to construction and manufacturing, maybe Luca, you can tell us how the construction value chain can help to decarbonize building.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I mean, the inputs before are really all kind of showing the importance of the looking at the whole value chain and the building. So this is actually very much at the core of our work that we are doing also, and the publication that we did recently on the building system carbon framework, of the importance to look at the overall life cycle of the buildings, as well as the system collaboration, how you bring all players together, and how you bring them all together under a common vision, the importance of making sure that everybody understands where we need to go. As I say, the decarbonization, the importance of achieving the decarbonization, with plenty of different measures on how we get there, and all more than valid. The recent UNFCCC climate action pathway is a full list of action that can be taken. They're all valid as long as we need to ensure we go to this north or southern star, and really to ensure net zero emission by 2050, or at least no later than 2050, but also intermediary target by 2030. We all kind of advocating at least to make sure that all buildings must be net zero in operation by 2030, and then at least 40, if not even 50% of embodied carbon in the new building. So this is the importance. It's a simple target, but this is very powerful because we ensure that at least we give the right message to policy, finance, to business, that we all together, we need to go there. So, and this is, yeah, it's really to show the importance of system-wide collaboration. So obviously system-wide, and it means kind of looking at the construction value chain, the building, how building get constructed from manufacturing, construction, real estate, and the end of life, the users. But also the influences, as Roland mentioned at the beginning, the importance of making sure that also the players that don't have a direct role in emitting carbon in the system, they are empowered to drive the change of on if and how buildings are constructed. So the financial sector, with the funding that they provide throughout the value chain, the investor, property developer, and designer and architects, as making sure that they are accountable, but also that they drive the net zero that we need. So that's where our framework really kind of tried to bring together the entire system through this common language, and making sure that everybody focus on the common goal of the system net zero, reaching net zero at system level, but enable as well each individual player to understand where and how they can contribute and how they can interact across the other stakeholder to then eventually collaborate to achieve net zero. So we cannot say one is better than the other, or this is better than that, or we should not do this compared to that, because as we need to kind of keep a view on what is the best solution, combination of solutions that enable us to achieve the common goal. That's where the importance of then having this vision as a system target, and this enables as well the individual company or sector to set their individual target, being science-based target, of course, or net zero, but any measure that allows them to reach, collaborate to reach that goal. So, seeing we are short on time, I'll stop here.
Thank you. So to conclude, we go.
No, I mean, just to conclude, this was a very exciting panel. I really learned a lot from all of your answers. And to make it very practical as a conclusion, we'd like to get views from the audience on which IEA analysis would benefit you most, in possible in light of the insights that the panelists gave, so that we can really choose the things, choose the work streams that would benefit you most and would be the most appropriate to the overall community. So as a conclusion, we'll just give perhaps 30 seconds, because we are already exceeding the 2 hours, to each panelist, according to them, what would be the most useful analysis that we could do. Perhaps starting with Cécile, not to put you on the spot, sorry.
No, it's fine. It's hard to find one. There are many ways that you could you could contribute. Maybe the one that I will choose, and Luca, you can go for the other one, is that you have a tremendous role there to play in really having one solid narrative in terms of filling the data gap and understanding what is the data narrative, and that would really strongly help in building the case and providing a framework to enable better comparison and provide more market certainty. So that would be my one.
Thanks. Are there other recommendations from other panelists?
Yes, it's Henk speaking. I was just typing, and then I will, will send it forward. I noted down integrate decarbonization in policy and standards, and build recommendations to countries versus their as-is situation based on ISO 52000 series. So that's in fact already focusing on this first part where I was talking about. We have to build trust, and we have to realize if you are taking certain measures and how to calculate the benefits and how to basically reward them. Like today in energy performance of buildings, you often see that it's directly related to the wallet. Some a colleague once recently said. And whereas decarbonization and climate is very much relating to the emotions of the people, but not that much to the wallet yet. And we have to make that link as well in order to make it, really let it feel to owners, people, all stakeholders basically in the business, but especially those who are deciding on where to put the money. Therefore, the reaction. Here it comes.
Okay. Anything from Tianjin or Luca?
Yeah, if I can add just very quickly, I think globally, but also act, locally. So I would suggest like, case studies to illustrate best practices, which tells successful stories, but also lessons learned. I think those can be really, helpful.
Okay, and the concluding word for Luca?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously the data and the importance of the data and the transparency and clarity on data, the 40% number is crucial to understand what we are, but maybe then the other one would be the importance of pathways. And I say pathways in the plural because we cannot have only one pathway to get to net zero. And the pathways that enable kind of for the system to decarbonize. And then what does it mean then? This helps to inform what does it mean for individual companies, individual sectors, and all the players to go to net zero. So these are obviously key information that the IEA data are used across different, already different target setting, like science-based target use the IEA as a is built on the IEA data. So this is very important, but that it focus on the whole system, really the 40%, how we go from the all 40% to zero.
Awesome. So now we have enough to keep us busy for 2021. Chiara, I see. We'll just thank you very much for being here, for your recommendations, for your inputs, and hand it over to Araceli for the concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think, well, this session has been recorded. It will be published also on the EIA website.
Perhaps it will be posted on YouTube, I think, but we'll share the link with you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot to everybody, and let's keep on the good work.
Thanks indeed, all of you. That was an excellent panel, very interesting. And as Thibaut said, I think you've kind of shaped up our plan more or less already. So that's very good. Indeed, we'll share the slides and possibly also the recording of the presentation on the website. So all participants can get access, and we'll address the pending questions by email as well. So yeah, indeed, thanks again to all of you. I know it's been a great effort, particularly for some colleagues joining from different regions in the world. So thanks again for all this, making the time to contribute to these discussions. We really would like to keep in touch, and we'll do. And yeah, if we don't see each other before, which I guess that will be the case, Merry Christmas to all of you. And we'll be certainly in touch in the new year. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.